My wife's being crazy. Good afternoon, you all. I will read another James Herriot story. I know it's not Christmas, but I like this story about a Christmas kitten. I had plenty of company for Christmas this year. We were billeted in the Grand Hotel, the massive Victorian pile which dominated Scarborough in turreted splendor from its eminence above the sea. And the big dining room was packed with several hundred shouting airmen. The iron discipline was relaxed for a few hours to let the Yuletide spirit run. It was so different from other Christmases I had known that it ought to have remained like a beacon in my mind, but I know that my strongest memory of Christmas will always be bound up with a certain little cat. I first saw her when I was called to see one of Mrs. Ainsworth's dogs, and I looked in some surprise at the furry black creature sitting before the fire. "I didn't know you have a cat," I said. The lady smiled. "We haven't. This is Debbie." "Debbie?" "Yes, at least that's what I call her. She's a stray. She comes here 2 or 3 times a week. We give her some food. I don't know where she lives, but I believe she spends a lot of time around one of the farms along the road." "Do you ever get the feeling that she wants to stay with you?" "No," Mrs. Ainsworth shook her head. "She's a timid little thing. Just creeps in, has some food, and then flits away. There's something so appealing about her, but she doesn't seem to want to let me or anybody into her life." I looked again at the little cat. "But she isn't just having food today." "That's right. It's a funny thing. But every now and again she slips through here into the lounge and sits by the fire for a few minutes. It's as though she's giving herself a treat." "Yes, I see what you mean." There was no doubt there was something unusual in the attitude of the little animal. She was sitting bolt upright on the thick rug which lay before the fireplace, in which the coals glowed and flamed. She made no effort to curl up or wash herself or do anything other than gaze quietly ahead. There was something in the dusty black of her coat, the half-wild, scrawny look of her, that gave me a clue. This was a special event in her life, a rare and wonderful thing. She was lapping up a comfort undreamed of in her daily existence. As I watched, she turned, crept soundlessly from the room, and was gone. "That's always the way with Debbie," Mrs. Ainsworth laughed. "She never stays more than 10 minutes or so, and then she's off." She was a plumpish, pleasant-faced woman in her 40s, the kind of client veterinary surgeons dream of, well off, generous, and the owners of 3 cosseted basset hounds. And it only needed that habitually mournful expression of one of the dogs to deepen a little, and I was round there post-haste. Today, one of the bassets had raised its paw and scratched its ears a couple of times, and that was enough to send its mistress scurrying to the phone in alarm. So my visits to the Ainsworth home were frequent but undemanding, and I had ample opportunity to look out for the little cat which had intrigued me. On one occasion I spotted her nibbling daintily from the saucer at the kitchen door. As I watched, she turned and almost floated on light footsteps into the hall, then through the lounge door. The 3 bassets were already in residence, draped snoring on the fireside rug. But they seemed to be used to Debbie, because 2 of them sniffed her in bored manner, a third merely cocked a sleepy eye at her, and flopped down on the rich pile. Debbie sat among them in her usual posture, upright, intent, gazing absorbedly into the glowing coals. This time I tried to make friends with her. I approached her carefully, but she leaned away as I stretched out my hand. However, by patient wheedling and a soft talk, I managed to touch her and gently stroke her cheek with one finger. There was a moment when she responded by putting her head on one side and rubbing back against my hand, but soon she was ready to leave. Once outside the door, she darted quickly along the road, then through a gap in the hedge, and the last I saw was the little black figure flitting over the rain-swept grass of a field. "I wonder where she goes," I murmured half to myself. Mrs. Ainsworth appeared at my elbow. "That's something we've never been able to find out." It must have been nearly 3 months before I heard from Mrs. Ainsworth. In fact, I had begun to wonder at the Bassett's long symptomless run when she came on the phone. It was Christmas morning, and she was apologetic. "Mr. Herriot, I am so sorry to bother you today of all days. I should think you would want to rest at Christmas like anybody else." But her natural politeness could not hide the distress in her voice. Please don't worry about that," I said. "Which one is it this time?" It's it's not one of the dogs. It's Debbie." "Debbie? She's at your house now?" "Yes, but there's something wrong. Please come quickly." Driving through the marketplace, I thought again that Derby on Christmas Day was like Dickens come to life. The empty square with the snow thick on the cobbles and hanging from the eaves of the fretted lines of roofs. The shops closed and the colored lights of the Christmas tree winking in the windows of the clustering houses, warmly inviting against the cold white bulk of the fells behind. Mrs. Ainsworth's home was lavishly decorated with tinsel and holly. Rows of drinks stood on the sideboard, and the rich aroma of turkey and sage and onion stuffing wafted from the kitchen. But her eyes were full of pain as she led me through the lounge. Debbie was there all right, but this time everything was different. She wasn't sitting upright in her usual position. She was stretched quite motionless on her side, and huddled close to her lay a tiny black kitten. I looked down in bewilderment. "What's happened here?" "It's the strangest thing," Mrs. Ainsworth replied. "I haven't seen her for several weeks. Then she came in 2 hours ago, sort of staggered in the kitchen. She was carrying the kitten in her mouth. She took it through to the lounge, laid it on the rug, and at first I was amused. I could see all was not well, because she sat as she usually does, but for a long time, over an hour, then she lay down like this, and she hasn't moved." I knelt on the rug and passed my hand over Debbie's neck and ribs. She was thinner than ever, her fur dirty and mud-caked. She did not resist as I gently opened her mouth. The tongue and mucous membrane were abnormally pale, and the lips ice cold against my fingers. When I pulled down her eyelid and saw the dead white conjunctiva, a knell sounded deep in my mind. I palpated the abdomen with grim certainty as to what I would find, and there was no surprise, only a dull sadness, as my fingers closed around a hard, lobulated mass deep among the viscera. Massive lymphosarcoma, terminal and hopeless. I put my stethoscope on her heart and listened to the increasingly faint, rapid beat. Then I straightened up and sat on the rug, looking sightlessly into the fireplace, feeling the warmth of the flames on my face. Mrs. Ainsworth's voice seemed to come from afar. "Is she ill, Mr. Harriet?" I hesitated. Yes, I'm afraid so. She has a malignant growth." I stood up. "There's absolutely nothing I can do. I'm sorry." Oh, her hand went to her mouth, and she looked at me wide-eyed. When at last she spoke, her voice trembled. "Well, you must put her to sleep immediately. It's the only thing to do. We can't let her suffer." "Mrs. Ainsworth," I said, "there's no need. She's dying now, in a coma. She is not suffering." She turned quickly away from me and was very still as she fought with her emotions. Then she gave up the struggle and dropped on her knees beside Debbie. "Oh, you poor little thing," she sobbed, stroked the cat's head again and again, as the tears fell unchecked on the matted fur. What she must have come through. I feel I ought to have done more for her." For a few minutes I was silent, feeling her sorrow so discordant among the bright seasonal colors of the festive room. Then I spoke gently. "Nobody could have done more than you," I said. "Nobody could have been kinder." "But I'd have kept her here in comfort. It must have been terrible out there in the cold when she was so desperately ill. I daren't think about it. And having kittens, too. I wonder, how many did she have?" I shrugged. "I don't suppose we'll ever know. Maybe just this one. It happens sometimes. And she brought it to you, didn't she?" "Yes, that's right. She did. Mrs. Ainsworth reached out, lifted the bedraggled black morsel. She smoothed her finger along the muddy fur, and the tiny mouth opened in a soundless meow. "Isn't it strange? She was dying, and she brought her Christmas here. And she brought her kitten here, and on Christmas Day. I bent. I put my hand on Debbie's heart. There was no beat. I looked up. She's gone. I lifted the small body, almost feather-light, wrapped it in a sheet which had been spread on the rug, and took it out to the car. When I came back, Mrs. Ainsworth was still stroking the kitten. The tears had dried on her cheeks. She was bright-eyed as she looked at me. "I've never had a cat before," she said. I smiled. "Well, it looks as though you've got one now." And she certainly had. The kitten grew rapidly into a sleek, handsome cat with a boisterous nature, which earned him the name of Buster. In every way, he was the opposite of his timid little mother. Not for him the privations of the secret outdoor life. He stalked the rich carpet of the Ainsworth home like a king, and the ornate collar he always wore added something more to his presence. On my visit, I watched his development with delight, but the occasion which stayed in my mind was the following Christmas Day, a year after his arrival. I was on my rounds as usual. I can't remember when I haven't had to work on Christmas Day because the animals have never got round to recognizing it as a holiday. But with the passage of years, the vague resentment I used to feel has been replaced by philosophical acceptance. After all, as I tramped around the hillside barns in the frosty air, I was working up a better appetite for my turkey than all the millions lying in bed or slumped by a fire. This was aided by the innumerable aperitifs I received from the hospitable farmers. I was on my way home, bathed in a rosy glow. I had consumed several whiskeys, the kind the inexpert Yorkshiremen pour as though it was ginger ale, and I had finished it with a glass of old Mrs. Earnshaw's rhubarb wine, which had seared its way straight to my toenails. I heard the cry as I was passing Mrs. Ainsworth's house. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Harriet." She was letting a visitor out the front door, and she waved at me gaily. "Come in. Have a drink to warm you up." I didn't need warming up, but I pulled up to the curb without hesitation. In the house, there was all the festive cheer of last year, the same glorious whiff of sage and onion which set my gastric juices surging. But there was no sorrow. There was Buster. He was darting up to each of the dogs in turn, ears pricked, eyes blazing with devilment, dabbing a paw at them and streaking away. Mrs. Ainsworth laughed. "You know, he plagues the life out of them, gives them no peace." She was right. To the Bassets, Buster's arrival was rather like the intrusion of an irreverent outsider in an exclusive London club. For a long time they had led a life of measured grace, regular sedate walks with their mistress, superb food in ample quantities, and long snoring sessions on the rugs and armchairs. Their days followed one upon another in an unruffled calm. And then Buster came. He was dancing up to the youngest dog again, sideways this time, head on one side, goading him. When he started boxing with both paws, it was too much even for the dignified Basset. He rolled over with the cat and had a brief wrestling match. "I want to show you something," Mrs. Ainsworth said. She lifted a hard rubber ball from the sideboard and went out to the garden, followed by Buster. She threw the ball across the lawn, and the cat bounded after it over the frosted grass, the muscles rippling along the black sheen of his coat. He seized the ball in his teeth, brought it back to his mistress, dropped it at her feet, and waited expectantly. She threw it, and he brought it back again. I gasped incredulously. A feline retriever. The Bassets looked on disdainfully. Nothing would ever have induced them to chase a ball. But Buster did it again and again and again, as though he would do it all day long. Mrs. Ainsworth turned to me. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" "No," I replied, "I never have. He is a most remarkable cat." She snatched Buster from his play, and we went back into the house, where she held him close to her face, laughing as the big cat purred and arched himself ecstatically against her cheek. Looking at him, a picture of health and contentment, my mind went back to his mother. Was it too much to think that dying little creature with the last of her strength had carried her kitten to the only haven of comfort and warmth she had ever known, in hopes that it would be cared for? Maybe it was, but it seemed I wasn't the only one with such fancies. Mrs. Ainsworth turned to me, and though she was smiling, her eyes were wistful. "Debbie would be pleased," she said. I nodded. Yes, she would. It was just a year ago today that she brought him, wasn't it? That's right. She hugged Buster to her. The best Christmas present I ever had.